lot of Western countries, European countries, sort of behave like rich countries while being poor is because we have for a long time relied on borrowing and low interest rates that have made these decisions seem like they're easy because, in fact, we are just kicking them into the future for future generations to pay for.
Politically speaking, why do you think it's just so difficult for governments to get this sort of big development happening?
In 2022, for example, if we take London, there was around 20,000 building starts. This year, it was 4,000.
From CapX, this is The Capitalist. I'm Benjamin Wilson, sitting in for Mark Sidwell this week. And my guests today are Alys Denby, opinion and features editor at City AM, and Dr. Lawrence Newport from the Looking for Growth campaign. Welcome both. When Labour took office, one of its first moves was to launch a new Towns Taskforce. Well, after a year touring the country, it identified 12 promising sites, many of them on the edges of major cities. Yet in the end, the government chose just 3, small in number and modest in scale. Together, they'll deliver only around 120,000 homes, which of course is a fraction of what's really needed. So what needs to be done to accelerate the development here? Lawrence, I know this is obviously something you're very passionate about, and it does often feel as if we're stuck inside the never-ending story with this particular issue. Do you think that the UK's planning rules are simply too complex to enable the sort of large-scale construction that's really needed to meet these targets?
Well, some of it is to do with the planning laws themselves, which obviously are desperately needing reform. If you have a country where you cannot get anything built, if it's roads, if it's rail, if it's power, if it's housing, you can't do it. That is a country which doesn't function and ends up, as we see, in stagnation and ultimately decline. However, the case that they can build more houses than they currently are, even under the current system. I'm not defending the current system by any standard, but it is actually an extra layer of failure to continue to fail so badly that not only are the rules not being changed nearly to the extent they should be, even the government's current attempts being more and more watered down, but actually in 2022, for example, if we take London, there was around 20,000 building starts. This year, it was 4,000. The rules haven't changed significantly. There have been some rule changes, but it's not just that as well. It's also the tax packages. There's about 7 or 8 different taxes when you're building homes, of which many of them it's unclear how much you're going to pay and at what point. And in fact, if you make too much money on housing, you can actually get extra taxes on top. It is a very confusing system. It is a poor system, but it's also the fact that politically, across the board, politicians have chosen and keep choosing to simply not push back and to simply not let anything get done or get built in this country.
Alys, I mean, as I was suggesting earlier, I mean, it does feel as if we talk about this issue a lot, and it feels at first glance that there's plenty of support out there in constituencies for something big to really happen in this arena. Politically speaking, why do you think it's just so difficult for governments to get this sort of big development happening?
But because I don't think there is the support that you talk about in the constituencies. I think what every MP comes up against in their own constituency, I mean, I've seen this myself. You'll have an MP who completely understands the growth agenda, whose constituents will complain to them that their grandchildren can't afford to live nearby, and yet a vocal minority, whenever there's a new proposal in whatever faceless village it might be, says this place can't change, we can't build here. The MP has to go out with a placard and campaign against it because that's what their electoral future depends on. So the political incentives are all against house building. But as Lawrence says, so is the planning system, especially here in London. So we have the 35% affordable housing target, which any developer would tell you just makes any development completely unviable to build. On top of that, we have the building safety regulator, which particularly affects taller buildings. A well-intentioned piece of legislation post-Grenfell, but it is blocking new building. And as a result, as Lawrence said, new starts in London have stopped. Nothing is getting built in London. I have this myself in my own community in Peckham where I live. There's a development for the Aylsham Centre. Like, this is just a an ugly old 80s shopping centre with a Morrison's and a huge car park. But yet every middle class gentrifier like me in Peckham is texting each other on like mum's school WhatsApp group saying you have to protest against this. You've got lefty comedians, James Acaster and Nish Kumar supporting this campaign. It's incredibly well networked, even in a gentrifying London community like this, full of young people who must know, who are facing, the sharp end of the housing crisis in terms of their rents and so on. Even so, they can't build in a brownfield site in the middle of London.
I think it's 100% true that some of this is simply the argument has not actually been made, and politicians have not wanted to make this argument. Certainly, 10 years ago, when I was first getting very interested in politics in various ways, just like reading more about it, etc., one thing really struck me was, why are people talking about building houses? If you build stuff, like how's this going to help anybody? It takes like extra steps of actual thinking and analysis to get through this. It might seem very obvious once you've been in this for a while, but from the outside world in, we only have to look at all of our cultural figures at the moment. Films and otherwise. Developers are the bad guys. This is like a world, a cultural world in which we exist, where even the way that we speak about the Industrial Revolution very publicly is often in a very negative way. Which is a mad thing to do when you think about just how much that changed living standards permanently across the globe. But this is something which does require, yes, a PR, but it's not just PR. It's also like bravery from politicians. The reality is people will, for instance, oppose nuclear power stations and they will oppose new roads. And then once they're in, people will actively campaign to keep them. Because that new road is incredibly useful to get to work. That new power station provides my friends' jobs, my own job. This becomes something. It's clean power. It's otherwise like actually once the building is done, they are very popular. The problem is our politicians are both short-termist and unable to make or willing to make the arguments. But it's also the case that there is not, until at least now, a coordinated effort on the side of building. At the moment, at Looking for Growth, we're trying to spin this up exactly. We have chapters all across the country, and one thing we're sending to those chapters is, here are planning applications in your local area. Here are housing, here is roads, here is rail, here's things you can do something about. Here's how you interact with the planning authorities and actually make the targeted arguments that Alys was correctly saying the other side makes all the time. And that's an important fight to actually have.
I think another problem is that these arguments are kind of counterintuitive to make. And that's a problem you come up again and again, I think, in free market discourse, is that if you say affordable housing targets are blocking affordable housing, it's difficult to comprehend. But that is exactly the case. Any developer would tell you, I cannot build this number of affordable houses. If you lowered the target, I would build more houses, many of which would be affordable. And the more houses you have, the more affordable houses become. But it's a slightly counterintuitive argument. And it's the same with the idea that, individual liberty is the best route to collective prosperity. It doesn't sound quite right. But when you think about it, it's better than communism. And yet that seems to be an easier argument to make.
I mean, it's a fascinating argument as well. I'm actually talking to you today from East London. Only a few streets away from me is the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park, which is one of the best examples, I think, of when London really did dream big and built something really big as well. So to talk about this from a PR perspective, I think pointing at that is a really good example of what can be built and how it can really be accepted and embraced by its local community as well. Interestingly, it is a borough of contrasts, though. You've got the Olympic Park, which is all very, very fancy, modern and new. A large part of Newham surrounding it is still quite in need of a bit more gentrification to bring it up to scratch with what people in London would expect. But one of the keys to the Olympic Park's success, of course, was the development corporations. Lawrence, do you think that an approach similar to what the Olympic Park used, with putting it in the hands of development corporations, could be a good template to apply elsewhere?
I think the actual solution to this is going to be radical planning reform. I think that the actual solution here is simplifying a bunch of the taxes. I think it's also politicians actually just learning that they have to say yes, because ultimately the reality is, even if they choose a short-term thing, even if they just think, okay, it's not popular to build anything, it is also extremely unpopular to have your country go into stagnation and decline. And what is actually happening is that they are paying those debts. They have for so long pushed off those difficult decisions, quote unquote difficult decisions about planning, about letting Britain build. And because of that, at least in part, that is why our two major parties are facing electoral oblivion, because people look at the world around them, systems don't work, they feel and actually are poorer. And this is all downstream of the fact that we don't grow our economy because we don't let anything build in this country.
Yeah, it's full of contradictions, really. Alys, just before we move on, I just want to talk a little bit about the political will again, because of course conservation and greenbelt protections, they're often pitched as some of the big obstacles to getting big developments off the ground and really tackling this housing shortage in a meaningful way. And yet at the same time, one of the most effective political communicators that we've seen at the moment has been Zach Polanski, really tapping into a lot of young people, getting a lot of the younger generation to get involved in politics, raising the membership or boosting the membership of the Green Party to record levels. Is there a bit of a messaging problem here with getting young people on board and getting them to understand that there is a bit of a connection here between those obstacles and the housing crisis, which of course does disproportionately affect younger people?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I have the answer to that, except to say that when it comes to, nature, like a newt or a bat is a better PR face for the campaign than a struggling young person who can't afford to rent a home. And it's the same, I think, with the Olympic Park, when you talk about what's a better PR win than like Mo Farah winning 2 gold medals, it's like just a great face for the whole thing. So, I mean, I do think that the left has been better at mobilizing these arguments. It's been better on the digital side of things. But I think what really gives me hope is Lawrence's campaign. I think, you guys are really stepping up. I think you guys really get the digital environment, and are making the arguments in a really clear, exciting and compelling way and a cross-party way. So I think we just need to keep pushing away.
Speaking of pushing away, let's push ahead to our next topic of the day, which is the Treasury groaning under the weight of its own promises with a £22 billion hole in the public finances. The Chancellor's instinct so far has been to patch it through higher taxes rather than tighter spending. But the average taxpayer now pays around £2,700 a year towards welfare, which is a figure that should prompt serious reflection on whether the system still works as intended. So what should be done to reform such a labyrinthine system? Lawrence, Britain's welfare state seems to have grown rather large and far too complex. Is it simply too big to be sustainable?
I think it's the case that it's particularly when the Chancellor was talking about potential tax rises. Obviously, we don't know, but potential tax rises. And there hasn't been a sustained look at really even what we are spending the money on. We are seeing right now, for instance, a large increase in PIP payments for things like anxiety. It's around about 600,000, over 600,000 people in the UK on PIP for anxiety. Now, obviously, there can be very, very, very serious forms of anxiety, but that number is absolutely massive, over 500,000 people. Much of this as well is able to certified via Zoom calls and otherwise. There's TikToks on how to get around the system. There are Reddit pages dedicated to how to get onto PIP and other systems as easily as possible. All at the same time, by the way, as parents of severely disabled children otherwise are actually finding it harder to get access to the money. We have a situation where if you play actually by the rules, it is very, very difficult, increasingly difficult to get access to the funds that all of us happily pay taxes to ensure people in those positions are looked after. Whereas if you want to scam and get around the systems, there are viral video after viral video after viral video telling you how to do this. Before raising taxes, the first examination by the Treasury and by the government should be on what are we actually spending our money on, how do we account for where it goes, and how do we improve this?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and I think it's one that would be lost on a lot of people. I remember a few years ago, a film that won the big award at the Cannes Film Festival was a British film called I, Daniel Blake, which was all about Britain's welfare system and how well, apparently cruel it was and difficult it was for people to work their way through. But what I think might have been lost on a lot of people who watched that film and were quite clearly affected by it is that the UK actually spends 4 times more on welfare than it did in 1960. And it does seem as if there's little improvement in any of the outcomes. Alys, do you think there's a bit of a disconnect between the reality of the welfare system and really people's perception of it?
Definitely. I remember when that film came out, I think Jeremy Corbyn was leading the Labour Party and he took his whole shadow cabinet off on a little field trip like it was a documentary rather than a work of fiction. I think you're right that there's a complete disconnect about what people's priorities for spending and taxation would be and the reality. I think nobody would think that we should be giving luxury cars to alcoholics, which is which can happen under mobility. Those people shouldn't be driving, right? And yet we also have a 2-child benefit cap, which seems to me to be punishing the 3rd child of someone who's born to a poor family. And I think we have this sense that, we all think that tax rises are inevitable in the budget because of this fiscal black hole. Well, we haven't even tried spending cuts. So I think I absolutely agree with Lawrence. Before we even start talking about tax rises, and let's be clear, we've already had enormous tax rises under this government. Fiscal drag is a de facto raise in income tax. They should try and cut something, but they've completely failed to do that with their welfare reforms. In fact, all they tried to do was to stop it going up by quite as much, and they couldn't even do that. They ended up spending more.
I mean, it's strange to think that it often feels as if we're in a very similar situation here to the one being seen in France, although the political situation there is far closer to crisis point. But recently I was watching some news and they were speaking to a lady on the street, a protester protesting against the pension reforms. And the journalist said to this lady, well, what do you think of these reforms? And she said, well, France is a rich country. We can afford it. And I think that really hit me because it made me think, well, hang on, there's a perception amongst the electorate here that France is a wealthy country and they can afford basically whatever is necessary to make the electorate happy. Lawrence, do you think in order to get the reality of Britain's finances through to people, perhaps we simply need to be closer to crisis point?
I mean, I think we're pretty close to crisis point, which is kind of also what you're saying. But I think it's one of those things that people are actually just extremely frustrated because they are paying more tax, but the systems are worse. I mean, nothing seems to function. And actually, even in systems where we are paying much more money, there is not an increase in efficiency or effectiveness or anything else. It seems that there is a constant downward trend in terms of, you will wait forever for a GP appointment. You will find yourself in these labyrinthine systems that take forever to get to what you actually want to get to, and systems that completely and utterly aid those who are happy to know the exact tricks to get through it, and shut out much more deserving people. This is something which is an actual systems problem. It's the kind of thing that a government with a massive majority should come in and basically look at every single aspect of governance and start to think about, okay, well, what do we actually do to make these systems effective? And that's something which you can explain to people as well, because part of the frustration you're hearing when people say, well, we're a rich country, we should be able to afford it, is that the government does pay for a lot of semi-random things as well. Like, we only just found out they spent several £billions hiding the fact that they had sent a list of our Afghan contacts to the Taliban. And that was just kind of kept off books for a while in various ways. Like, the government can suddenly find vast amounts of money if it wants to cover its own back. So people rightfully feel quite frustrated when they're told, well, you can't have the thing that you want because it might be too expensive, when they aren't actually even looking at where can we save money effectively.
Yeah. Go ahead, Alys.
Yeah, and I think another reason why a lot of Western countries, European countries, sort of behave like rich countries while being poor is because we have for a long time relied on borrowing and low interest rates that have made these decisions seem like they're easy, because in fact we are just kicking them into the future for future generations to pay for.
Yeah, and just on that, Alys, actually, before we move on, a lot of talk around reining in some of the benefits system is focused on ensuring that any welfare reform doesn't harm genuinely vulnerable people. But I suppose the difficulty Labour experienced when trying to rein in the winter fuel allowance might suggest that the concerns aren't just about harming vulnerable people. Do you think it's simply become far too much of a politically contentious issue to the point where basically everyone's afraid to touch it now.
Well, it looks that way, but I don't understand why a government with a majority as big as this one's is afraid. What? I mean, it's just pathetic.
To pick up exactly on this, what is even more mad is that not only had they had the majority, but they've seen what happened to the last guys who didn't do anything, and they are facing the oldest political party in human history, facing oblivion. And they're looking down the exact same path and making the exact same mistakes. That is absolutely stunning.
Yeah, it does make you wonder, if you can't make meaningful change when you've got a majority this big, when can you? Well, that is a story we'll have to continue following, particularly as next month's budget draws ever closer. But finally today, business leaders, policymakers and industry voices gathered in London recently for a talk hosted by the Central London Alliance to chart a course for the capital's economic future. Now, the message was clear. London must become more fiscally competitive if it's to reclaim lost ground. Panelists called for measures to lure back the 16,500 millionaires who've already left the United Kingdom and taken their investment with them. Now, a globally attractive tax regime, they argued, is essential to reignite domestic growth. But what can this city meaningfully do to turn things around? Alys, there was clearly a lot of appetite here for simplifying the tax system. How much influence do you think London can have on such policies?
I think one of the worst and most negative trends in recent politics, particularly post-Brexit, has been the move away from London, a sort of a belief that London can just kind of look after itself, and that we need to focus on levelling up, essentially moving growth and economic activity away from our most important, most globally significant economic asset. It's also particularly frustrating because you talk to people in London, people who built businesses here, nobody is more committed to the growth agenda than they are, but they feel like the government cares much more about, people elsewhere. So it's extremely frustrating, but we know what the answers are. A massive collapse in IPOs in London, the flight of wealth out of the capital, which is a direct result of punitive non-dom taxes, the idea that you should pay inheritance tax on your wealth wherever you earned it, whether it's in London or not, and taxes on things that wealthy people like to consume, like private school fees, just suggest that this government despises wealth. It thinks that they're just leeches on society and sources of tax revenue. So no wonder people are leaving to jurisdictions like Milan, which are welcome, or indeed the Middle East, which are welcoming them with open arms. But there are some easy solutions. Stamp duty on shares would be a quick win to bring investment back into the capital. Abolishing stamp duty on property would be a great way to get our property market moving again, and all the other things we've talked about in terms of planning reform. And I think just having a sense that wealth creators and financial services in the City of London is not just about enriching an elite. It's about creating jobs and prosperity for the entire country, and just shows London a bit more love, I think.
Lawrence, we were talking a little bit about earlier about the disconnect between political realities and accepted realities, I suppose you might call it. And I think another example of that is the impact that wealthy people have on the world around us and our economy. It's a very easy thing to say, we're going to introduce a wealth tax and it will fix all of our problems. But the reality is we've seen 16,500 millionaires leave London, and there's every reason to believe that they'll have more chances to leave us as well if things keep going as they have been. Just politically speaking, do you think London is still seen as a competitive global city right now?
I mean, the thing is, London has such an incredible baseline to start from. I think it is very actually easy to make the case that London is literally the best city in the world to live in. There are loads of reasons why that's the case. And it is in fact something which people say to us repeatedly at LFG events who have moved away, is that they are clamoring. They fly over for a single night sometimes to come along to one of our events. Someone's just in a pub to drink and talk to people and say, I'm here because I actually just want to come home. Like, no matter the tax breaks elsewhere, no matter the standard of living elsewhere, they want to be in London, and they want, the moment it can make sense for them, they want to come home. And this is because it is quite literally the best city on earth to live in. Now that is something that we have to work on. It isn't just, though. I mean, actually, Alys's list of things that could change is exactly on, in my view. But it's not just that. It's things like crime. Crime is a big reason I'm talking to startup founders who are leaving. One of them told me recently they have an office in Mayfair, and they'd had their phone stolen, and they asked their staff, how many of you have had your phone stolen in the last 6 months? Half the hands in the room went up. And they've had to use the hallway to their office to store everyone's bikes in because they kept getting stolen. That is something which eventually they said, it doesn't make sense to pay the amount of rent I'm paying, the amount of tax I'm paying in order to be in an office space where my own staff don't feel safe. This is just completely ridiculous. And so they're leaving. It is also the case, of course, that it's easier for American companies to come in and take our startups, which they are doing more and more, because we've made it basically illegal for our pension funds, which have vast amounts of money, to invest in their own startups. This is an insane situation. It is also difficult to even get British startups into government procuring as a part of the procurement process. So in loads of ways, we've stacked the deck against our own companies, which London leads in. And as a result, because of a whole section of factors that are all intertwined together, people are leaving, but they want to come back, and they will come back. We don't have to do much to do it. We just have to do it quickly.
Well, I mean, a lot of British people probably think I'm crazy for saying this, but I think the UAE looks way too hot for me. I don't want all that sunshine. I'm an Australian. I came to London. I like the bleak grey skies like we have today. Don't hate
dramatic grey skies, not bleak. Dramatic.
Dramatic, exactly. Dramatic, perfect word. Well, that brings a rather dramatic show to an end for today. Alys Denby and Lawrence Newport, thanks both very much for joining us today. Now, make sure you're subscribed to our daily email briefings. Go to capex.co. That's CAPX.co. I'm Benjamin Wilson. Goodbye.